Hello everyone. So this is going to be a quick video because I've been really light on uploads lately, even news content, and I'm going to be out of town from June 24th to July 6th. I have an essay about 80% completed, and there are a bunch of news stories I really want to talk about in the meantime, but otherwise I'm not going to be able to. So, on top of that, I also want to be able to immediately begin writing a new essay when I come back, so I need this one to be finished. Anyway, so within the last day, Senator Josh Hawley, yes, the same weaselly little fuck who proposed a bill that would cartelize the gaming industry so that only a handful of AAA developers could legally sell games, and which would make it illegal to develop and publish games of certain genres under the narrative of banning loot box sales, has now decided that he's going to propose a similar bill, but this time, instead of appealing to the Reddit state theist Cheeto Finger Fedora Brigade, the state is appealing to people who are being censored by social media websites by attempting to convince them that the state is functioning in their interests, and that the real source of their problems are anyone but the political elite, so that the state can expand its influence over society without any significant social unrest. Now, I have many videos going over or explaining the Machiavellian propaganda narrative the state has constructed around the internet and social media through direct tax subsidies, taking away their incentive to compete and serve their customers, regulations and programs such as Operation Choke Point, which make it more difficult to compete and allow the government to deplatform political dissenters by using the FDIC to determine certain people to be high-risk clients, so banks will have to disassociate with platforms hosting the content or risk violating finance regulations, political think tanks such as the Atlantic Council dictating their terms of service, along with absolutely a diabolical level of control over the mainstream media's narratives and creating domestic propaganda programs which the state has through the CIA's Operation Mockingbird program and through NGO state-funded organizations such as the Council on Foreign Relations. Basically, the government manufactures domestic propaganda directed towards people who are disillusioned with the state and the political elite's agenda, and they have many ways of doing this, but the most common is the problem reaction solution routine, where a problem is invented, or in this case manufactured, through mainstream media narratives and state programs, covert state programs, which make people feel vulnerable and helpless. Then the state's agenda, which is always to expand its influence over society, is offered under the guise of combating the problem which the state manufactured, and the state, of course, misdirects the blame away from the political elite and the state. And one of the crucial points of their narrative has to be to trick people into thinking that the state fundamentally can function in every person's interests, and that everything the state does, if they're ever in a situation where there's massive public outcry over something, is the fault of ideologically motivated politicians or outside actors entirely, not properly operating the state and representing the people. Of course, this is patently absurd because everyone's interests are different and vary in a practically infinite amount of ways with one another. Some people's interests directly run contrary to the mere existence of a political elite. And then there's the contradiction of being coercively ruled while having dominion over the organization which rules you simultaneously. I could go on with the problems with this concept, and I indeed have in great length in some of the past essays on this channel, that I have up, but the point here is that this is not true. Nothing the state does or ever can do fundamentally can be in your interests. Everything the state does is at your expense and in the interest of a small group of political elites. So, whenever a politician is claiming to propose a law which will be in the interests of society or the people, you should know by default that they're selling some pretty rank snake oil. Actually, that's an insult to snake oil salesmen because while it's a relatively similar sales tactic that politicians and snake oil salesmen both use, snake oil salesmen don't rob you and use the money they stole to fund an army of people to continue robbing larger and larger amounts to keep funding more people for their army until the system they've created collapses society, because they're also using coercion to keep all their competitors off the market. But anyway, so now with this taken into consideration, let's get to the actual bill and the narrative which the media and the politicians are attempting to create around it, which is that this law would merely have online social media platforms be legally recognized as publishers if they were politically biased in any way, that this would only apply to big corporations above 30,000 active users in the United States, and smaller competitors would be exempt, and that this is just necessary because the tech companies got too big without the government getting involved. Now, we can already scratch the third point off the list because I've already more or less demonstrated that every problem with online platforms is caused or influenced directly by the government. But this narrative also makes two other stupid and patently incorrect assumptions. The first being that the government can create innovations or decentralize the market through force, and the second being that market actors without state involvement will get too big, so to speak. Governments can only centralize resources. In fact, the government itself is just a monopoly on arbitration which came into existence through systemic coercion, and because the state can only use coercion to do anything, the state naturally cannot have competition because politicians simply can use force to take any resource that they want or need the state needs to sustain itself. On top of this, any organization which is operated by or is having their mode of operation dictated by the state through a board such as the FTC will necessarily be functioning in the state's singular interests of obtaining more resources for itself and propagandizing. Because the state has full dominion over how these firms operate, and as such they no longer can be considered independent actors with their own interests. And this is the measure a state takes when, quote-unquote, making a market more competitive. It sets up a single licensing board or trade association which all legal producers have to comply to the standards of. Decentralization comes naturally as a result of innovation because innovation is the only way to create a higher productive capacity without sacrificing material gains. And innovation can only be incentivized by competition within a market system because this is the only case in which firms have an interest to speculate with their resources to appeal to their consumers. So if the state comes along and creates a licensing regulation or a new board which controls who can or can't become a producer, along with how they can or can't manage their resources, you are necessarily going to experience a decline in innovation in the former situation, and a decline in productive capacity and therefore the quality of living in the latter due to the artificial scarcity which will be created. Now, for the former two narratives, well, wrong and extra wrong, which should be obvious right from the start, given that this new law is being described as an audit, a term which legally refers to the examination of an organization's finances. And also, the publisher-platform dichotomy is centered around the notion that if websites were not legally recognized as platforms, they would be subject to criminal liability for inaction. For example, if someone were to post libel about another person, the platform could be sued for that. Which, of course, doesn't hold the scrutiny because you can't prove a negative. That's the logical fallacy known as onus probandi, or shifting the burden of proof, which outside of demonstrable logic and taken into the realm of statism, there are numerous Supreme Court cases which have concluded with the burden of proof being placed on a passive party for their inaction to be impossible. Prominent examples being Warren versus the District of Columbia, the Shawnee versus Winnebago County, and recently Marjorie Douglas High Students versus Broward County. Yeah, you know those cases where government services didn't serve people despite the fact that said people are stolen from to fund them? Ah, it feels so amazing to throw the state's double standards back in their faces later when they're trying to construct propaganda narratives down the road. Also, publishers or platforms being held criminally liable for inaction would violate the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Not to mention how ironic it is to see the same politicians and media personalities who not even a year ago were having an absolute conniption fit about the war-hawking neocon Supreme Court judge Brett Kavanaugh, who went out of his way on one of his days off to defend the Patriot Act back in the mid-2000s because he got Me Too'd on the same grounds that they're now claiming is justified for social media companies to be held criminally liable on. Also, I can't help but notice that creating this new regulation is being framed by the politicians, particularly Josh Hawley himself, and the media, as a repeal of subsidies for the social media companies, implying, of course, in advance that the nightmare dystopia hellscape which would follow this bill becoming a law is the fault of free markets, and trying to lead people away from the actual ways in which have already been highlighted that the government is causing the problems on social media, and instead implying that somehow these companies are being subsidized by not being regulated enough. Yeah, I don't think they thought this part of the narrative through enough. It's like the political elite couldn't choose between blaming free markets and blaming ideological actors within the state who are totally in no way acting in the state's interests, writing regulations which don't work in the favor of the general population, but that the market in question just needs good regulations. So they created a demon spawn crack baby of a shit to yourself contradicting propaganda narrative and shat it out without looking at it twice. But both of these points are just outright shameless fucking lies. Not even cute little white lies or using misleading language, though the bill does that as well, as I'm about to show you. Like, the bill just straight up doesn't even say the things which Josh Hawley and these controlled opposition media personalities claim that it does. First of all, nowhere in this bill does it say that social media platforms are legally going to be redefined as publishers. What it actually says is that the Federal Trade Commission would be creating licenses and operating as a licensing board, which would prevent them from being targeted by the IRS or deemed criminal by the state, but only if these platforms behave in a politically neutral manner, which of course the bill provides no concrete definition for what that term means, which means that the new national TOS for every functional website is whatever the state wants them to, based entirely on the arbitrary whims of FTC commissioners. So effectively, this would nationalize social media. Secondly, the bill does not say that platforms of under 30 million active monthly users, which make fewer than 500 million in annual revenue are exempt from this law. What it says is that websites which are under this size aren't taxed more by the IRS, but still do have to conform to the FTC's new terms of service. In conclusion, though, I would argue that this is probably a milker bill. For those unfamiliar, a milker bill is a bill which is not intended to become a law, but is proposed for two purposes: to obtain funds from lobbyists, or to propagandize the population into thinking that their interests are being taken into consideration. In most cases, it's both, and that's no exception here. The reason I'd say this is because there's no effective way for political content to be made neutral, since that concept itself is disputed, and because literally everything could be considered politically biased, since there's no specification on this bill's terms. For instance, what counts as political content? What counts as being bias? What if an idea is just organically more popular in the algorithms of some website because more people interact with content that promotes these ideas, or because more content which promote these ideas are created? Is it considered politically biased if this content is overrepresented in search results? If so, then the state would have to be suppressing political ideas and promoting others in the aims of achieving neutrality, which, for most people who are promoting, this bill and trying to claim that this is what's necessary, the market has failed and this is necessary, that would basically be the exact opposite of what they want. But if not, then you don't have a politically neutral platform. But even if this law was possible to enforce, every website online, to avoid being harassed by the government or criminalized, would have to moderate all content posted before it was published, which would cost so much money that it would be almost certainly single-handedly not only the cause of every online company to go bankrupt immediately, but also the proprietary software model as a whole, in turn indirectly leading to the decentralization of the internet through counter-economics, which is the last fucking thing the state wants, because that would make all associations online impossible to track. But more, I think that this was intended to test the waters to see if the population had been propagandized to where there wouldn't be any major figures calling out the state's bullshit if they proposed yet another thinly veiled nationalization of social media, which is the only thing stopping the state from doing so. Because if people are under the impression that the spread of information and their general autonomy is being suppressed by the state, they will seek out decentralized platforms and invest heavily in ways to undermine the state. Based on the fact that the one thing every proposed milker bill so far regarding social media censorship, without exception, has in common with one another is the inclusion of a national terms of service dictated by the FTC. The true agenda of the state here is relatively obvious. The ability to freely share philosophical concepts has made narratives more difficult to create, simply because there are more outlets of information being presented by more groups on all sorts of issue. A large majority of the population, as a result, have become disillusioned with the current political order because they've found information they otherwise wouldn't have, which works against the interests of the political elite, and have led people to realize that the state functions and can only function in a manner diametrically opposed to their own interests. The state tried to manipulate the terms of service of certain websites through front groups, political think tanks, regulations, or subsidies, But opposing narratives not only didn't die out, but became stronger as those people who presented those opposing narratives now had all of this information to present to people, which just made people even angrier. So now the state's looking to just straight up try and control all the content published on any social media website online by nationalizing these websites and manually monitoring all posts before they're posted, which the state could afford to do, since it can simply steal more money if it needs more, or divert funds from other programs and call it a tax cut. And this last bill specifically, I believe, was just testing how the public reacted to the concept of manually vetting posts before they were posted, specifically based on the fact that mainstream outlets such as Slate are pointing this out to their audience. They already, throughout the last year, were testing how well the idea of nationalizing the internet through a national terms of service dictated by the FTC would go over, and conditioning people to that concept. The fact that the state is moving forward is disturbing because it indicates that the intelligence agencies, at the very least, believe to themselves that the population is conditioned to where they would receive little to no backlash towards the state once they reach their conclusion. However, what I don't think that the state is taking into consideration, like usual, is that this would merely incentivize people to engage in counter-economics to meet their own ends by trading around the state and establishing ways to get around the legal trackable internet so that they could freely spread ideas and files. So really, in the end, the politicians are just making more dumb mistakes and unintentionally hastening their own demise further. Though it would still do wonders to share this video around, because aside from the fact that making people aware that the state can never function in their interests would do wonders for counter-economies and libertarianism in general, I've been getting targeted by YouTube's algorithms recently, as you can probably see by the view counts of my newer videos. So actively sharing any and all content of mine is greatly appreciated and is endlessly helpful for spreading messages like this and putting this channel out there. Anyway, thank you all for watching. If you like this video, please comment, rate, and subscribe, and I will see you all next time.